All right, here we are with chapter 3. So this is the picture across from the start of chapter 3. And again, we can see that Arthur doesn't look very happy. Mr. Lambchop looks happy enough, and Stanley looks quite pleased. So again, it's Arthur who's just not having a good time with this. Chapter 3 is called Stanley the Kite. Mr. Lambchop had always liked to take the boys out with him on Sunday afternoons to a museum or roller skating in the park, but it was difficult when they were crossing streets or moving about in crowds. Remember that they live in a city, and so even just crossing a street or going for a walk down the sidewalk can be very busy and a little dangerous. Stanley and Arthur would often be jostled from his side, and Mr. Lambchop worried about speeding taxis or that hurrying people might accidentally knock them down. It was easier after Stanley got flat. Mr. Lambchop discovered that he could roll Stanley up without hurting him at all. He would tie a piece of string around Stanley to keep him from unrolling and make a little loop in the string for himself. It was as simple as carrying a parcel, and he could hold on to Arthur with the other hand. Stanley did not mind being carried because he had never much liked to walk. Arthur didn't like to walk either, but he had to. It made him mad. I don't know about you guys or in your family, but in my family, Tori and Leah always seem to be competing with each other, and it's not fair if one of them gets something and the other one doesn't. So I think they would be upset in a situation like this if one of them got to be carried everywhere and the other one had to walk. One Sunday afternoon in the street, they met Ralph Jones, an old college friend of Mr. Lambchop's. "Well, George, I see you have bought some wallpaper," Mr. Jones said. "Going to decorate your house, I suppose?" "Wallpaper?" said Mr. Lambchop. "Oh, no, this is my son Stanley." He undid the string and Stanley unrolled. "How do you do?" Stanley said. "Nice to meet you, young feller," the man said. "Georgie," he said to Mr. Lambchop, "that boy is flat." "Smart, too," Mr. Lambchop said. "Stanley is third from the top in his class at school." "Phooey," said Arthur. "This is my younger son, Arthur," Mr. Lambchop said, "and he will apologize for his rudeness." Arthur could only blush and apologize. Do you guys know what it means to blush? That's when your cheeks turn red because you're embarrassed or nervous about something. Mr. Lambchop rolled Stanley up again and they set out for home. It rained quite hard while they were on the way. Stanley, of course, hardly got wet at all, just around the edges. But Arthur got soaked. Late that night, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop heard a noise out in the living room. They found Arthur lying on the floor near the bookcase. He had piled a great many volumes of the Encyclopedia Britannica on top of himself. "Put some more on me," Arthur said when he saw them. "Don't just stand there. Help me." So you can see that Arthur has these books on top of him. So the Encyclopedia Britannica, we've talked a little bit, I think, in school about encyclopedias. They are really thick books that people used to use before we had the internet to look everything up. And so when people didn't have computers and smartphones, if we wanted to learn about something, we looked it up in a book. And encyclopedias were books, and there would be usually about 25 of them in a series, and each book would have words or things that started with a different letter of the alphabet. And of course, maybe X, Y, and Z would all fit into one, but there might be 2 encyclopedias for the letter T or something like that. But the books were in alphabetical order, much like a dictionary, and you could look up information about a topic. So a little bit like a dictionary, because they're in ABC order and have a whole bunch of different words and ideas in them, but different in that it didn't just tell you what a word means. It could actually tell you a page or sometimes 3 or 4 pages about something. But in order to have all that information in them, those books were really thick, And you guys know that if a book is really thick, it is really heavy. So, these really thick, heavy books, Arthur's piling them on top of himself. Can you think of a reason that he might do that? Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop sent him back to bed, but the next morning they spoke to Stanley. Arthur can't help being jealous, they said. Be nice to him. You are his big brother, after all. So if Arthur is jealous, that means he wants what Stanley has, or wants to be like Stanley. I think Arthur was trying to make himself flat. The next Sunday, Stanley and Arthur went to the park by themselves. The day was sunny, but windy too, and many older boys were flying beautiful, enormous kites with long tails, made in all the colors of the rainbow. Arthur sighed. Someday, he said, I will have a big kite, and I will win a kite-flying contest and be famous like everyone else. Nobody knows who I am these days. Stanley remembered what his parents had said. He went to a boy whose kite was broken and borrowed a large spool of string. You can fly me, Arthur, he said. Come on. He attached the string to himself and gave Arthur the spool to hold. He ran lightly across the grass, sideways to get up speed, and then he turned to meet the breeze. Up, 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 up went Stanley, being a kite. He knew just how to manage on the gusts of wind. He faced full into the wind if he wanted to rise, and let it take him from behind when he wanted speed. He had only to turn his thin edge to the wind, carefully, a little at a time, so that it did not hold him, and then he would slip gracefully down toward the earth again. Arthur let out all the string, and Stanley soared high above the trees, a beautiful sight in his red shirt and blue trousers against the pale blue sky. Everyone in the park stood still to watch. Stanley swooped right and then left in long matched swoops. He held his arms by his sides and zoomed at the ground like a rocket and curved up again toward the sun. He side-slipped and circled and made figure eights and crosses and a star. Nobody had ever flown the way Stanley Lambchop flew that day. Probably no one ever will again. After a while, of course, people grew tired of watching, and Arthur got tired of running about with the empty spool. Stanley went right on, though, showing off. All right, so there is a picture of the park. There's lots of people in the park, and you can see Arthur. You can see Arthur there holding onto the string that Stanley's attached to. And so everybody thinks Stanley is quite impressive because he's doing all this fancy work. But eventually it gets kind of boring to watch someone be doing something and not doing it yourself. 3 boys came up to Arthur and invited him to join them for a hot dog and some soda pop. Arthur left the spool wedged in a fork of a tree. He did not notice, while he was eating the hot dog, that the wind was blowing the string and tangling it about the tree. The string got shorter and shorter, but Stanley did not realize how low he was until leaves brushed his feet, and then it was too late. He got stuck in the branches. 15 minutes passed before Arthur and the other boys heard his cries and climbed up to set him free. Stanley would not speak to his brother that evening, and at bedtime, even though Arthur had apologized, Stanley was still cross, which means angry. So remember, Stanley was kind of showing off being a kite, and then when Arthur got tired of watching and waiting, he hooked the end of the string into a tree, around a tree branch, and he did that so that Stanley could keep on flying and showing off, but Arthur wouldn't have to hold the string. But that plan backfired because the string got tangled, and as the string got tangled, it got shorter and shorter until eventually Stanley just actually got tangled with it. Alone with Mr. Lambchop in the living room, Mrs. Lambchop sighed and shook her head. "You're at the office all day, having fun," she said. You don't realize what I go through with these boys. They're very difficult." "Kids are like that," Mr. Lambchop said. "Phases. Be patient, dear." That is the end of chapter 3.